and welcome to the 7th event of the 2015-2016 Oakland Speaker Series. I'm Jim Weil, I'm president of the series, and I'll be your host tonight. Tonight's guest is a local guy made good, coming to us from the Peninsula, where he and his wife Sharon are longtime subscribers to the Peninsula Speaker Series. Dr. Ross Stein is one of the world's foremost experts in earthquakes. After a long career at the U.S. Geological Survey in Menlo Park, he is now scientist emeritus at USGS and is the co-founder and CEO of Temblor.net, which is the product that we sent you information to download yesterday. Temblor.net puts information in the hands of homeowners formerly known only to insurance companies, and which he will demonstrate during his remarks. His work has taken him all over the world, and his principal insight is that earthquakes are often chain reactions in which falling domino quakes can rupture an entire fault or set of faults, or in which one quake can shut down faults around it. And believe it or not, you'll understand that when he finishes tonight. He is the developer of a tool to forecast how earthquakes promote or inhibit one another called Coulomb 3.4, which is in wide use around the world. Ross is also the co-founder of the Global Earthquake Model Foundation in Pavia, Italy. This public-private partnership is building the first seismic risk model for the world. He is a very popular instructor at Stanford University, teaching a class called Scientific Presentation and Public Speaking to PhD students in the earth sciences, a course he developed to teach young scientists the joy and skills of bringing their discoveries to the public. Dr. Stein has appeared in documentaries produced by Nova, Discovery, the BBC, and National Geographic, has been a guest on NPR, CNN, and local TV and radio news programs, and is frequently quoted in local and national publications. Ross is a gifted communicator, having spoken at over 60 universities and research organizations and to audiences ranging from Goldman Sachs to the Smithsonian Institution Presidential Awards for Excellence in Math and Science Teaching. Dr. Stein received his Bachelor of Science degree from Brown University, magna cum laude, and his PhD from Stanford. Please extend a warm welcome to Dr. Ross Stein.
Let me begin at the ending. Nearly everything we love about the Bay Area has been brought to us by the faults. Napa Valley, Portola Valley, and Silicon Valley. Tamales Bay, San Francisco Bay, and Monterey Bay. Even Lake Tahoe. The Hayward Fault lifts up the Oakland and Berkeley Hills, creating their magnificent sunset views of the Golden Gate. The San Gregorio Fault makes Big Sur big. A bend in the San Andreas thrust up the Santa Cruz Mountains, the spine of the peninsula, and the Marin Headlands. These coastal ranges temper our climate, bathe us in fog, and crown us in redwoods. What I want you to see is that we enjoy the fruits of the faults every day. So we have to learn to live with their occasional spoils. As befell the Bay Area in 1868, 1906, and 1989, and the Southland in 1857, 1971, and 1994. You'll see tonight that although we can't predict earthquakes, we know where and why the hazard is high, and we know how to build structures that can withstand anything the faults can hurl at them. We'll move from the discovery of gold to the discovery of what an earthquake is and how earthquakes interact. And I'll leave you with the means to assess your own seismic risk to ensure the safety of your own family. So let me start here with the world as it was given to us in the plate tectonics revolution 50 years ago, which was the realization that the surface of the earth isn't fixed and rigid, it's mobile, with about a dozen great plates moving at a fraction of an inch to several inches a year. Where these plates pull apart from each other, we have the globe encircling mid-ocean ridges, which are lime yellow on this globe. And where the plates collide with each other, these magenta bands, the denser of the two opposing plates is shoved under the lighter one, forming subduction zones, the hatcheries of the world's largest earthquakes. Now, the 1906 earthquake threw down evidence that the Earth had to be mobile, that it couldn't be rigid. But that earthquake, 60 years before plate tectonics, that discovery wouldn't have been possible had it not been for the gold rush 60 years beforehand. And that's the story I'd like to start with tonight. So here it is, two small paragraphs in the Californian in 1848, seeming at the bottom to foretell not the gold rush but the tech boom. So the idea, what this did, as soon as this was announced, the Federal Army came to California, assayed the gold, and confirmed the discovery. And once that happened, it launched the largest armada of ships the world had ever known. 60,000 people around the world abandoned their jobs, homes, and families and boarded ships for the Golden Gate. Now, the idea was that what would happen is there'd be some miners out there at Mile Rock and they just wave the ships in with a hanky. But if any of you have been outside the Golden Gate, you know it really doesn't work that way. This has some of the steepest waves anywhere on the California coast, the highest winds, the densest fog, and the fastest currents, currents that can be faster than these boats. There's shallows, the potato patch. And so what happened is many of these boats, after sailing halfway around the world, came to grief outside the gate. And so the federal government sent the Coast and Geodetic Survey to make decent navigation maps. This is what the ship captains had been working with. This looks nothing like the California coast. And the idea was that the captain was supposed to line the ship up so Alcatraz was in the middle of the gate and just shoot the rapids. And it really didn't work out. Now, it wasn't until the 1970s that long distances could be accurately measured. That awaited the invention of the laser. So in the 1850s, what was measured instead were angle changes. So if I had a theodolite here, I could measure the angle between one mountaintop and another. And then by moving that theodolite to many places, all those angles would be measured, and from that, an accurate map could be made. And what happened is these surveys were made in the 1850s, and every time the instruments became more accurate or lighter, they came back every 10 years or so and resurveyed all these points in an effort to make a yet more accurate navigation map. Now here's a peculiarity if you're making a map from measuring angles. If I have this square here and I paint that on a balloon and I inflate the balloon so the square gets bigger, do any of those angles change? No. So if the land expanded or contracted, this was invisible to people making these measurements. But what about if this square sheared? If the square sheared, two of the angles get smaller and two get larger. So purely as an accident of making maps by measuring angles, these surveys were sensitive to shearing of the land, which of course nobody thought was occurring. So here's the map that was made and completed in 5 years. It's as accurate as any you'll find today. It's just a beautiful work of science and art, and I love the fact that it even includes sailing directions on a geodetic map. You can also see San Francisco as a gold rush city, so let's zoom in on that. So here's San Francisco, just 3 years after the gold rush began. It had already burned down to the ground twice. The city had gone from 15,000 people to 100,000 people in a year and a half. And you can see Mission Bay, Yerba Buena Cove, and the Marina. These are the two principal anchorages for the ships that came in to bring the gold rush miners. let me show you a contemporary photograph of Yerba Buena Cove. So here's what it looked like in 1851. And notice how amazingly dense San Francisco's already is in terms of buildings. In this picture, I count about 70 ships. Now look at Yerba Buena Cove just 2 years later. It's almost uncountable, but there are 700 ships in this picture. Now look again. These ships are falling apart. So here's what happened. The ships would sail in. The moment they dropped anchor, the passengers would rush off the boat, board steamships to Sacramento, and head into the goldfields. And so would the crew. Because the crew members could make 10 times more salary as gold miners than as sailors. And none of these ships ever sailed home. So think about it. This is the most lucrative shipping line in the world, and they're all one-way trips. It would be like everybody, all the Ubers, dropping everybody off at AT&T Park, and then the drivers just abandoning the cars. Really wouldn't work out. So what happened is these ships simply rotted in place, and eventually the city built a railway from Golden Gate Park and dumped sand over them, and that became the rest of San Francisco. And here's an example of one of these Gold Rush ships exhumed 15 years ago at the foot of the Transamerica Tower next to Portsmouth Square. So let's go back to the map and now compare the Gold Rush city to the city today. So you can say that it's grown considerably. What's more important is that this junk land, if you like, shakes very hard in an earthquake because it's unconsolidated and water can squirt through the sediments and the kind of rotting hulks of these ships. And so in an earthquake, these are the 3 areas most vulnerable to shaking, and it's where the damage is greatest. This is really San Francisco's Achilles heel. So it's kind of amazing to think that Yerba Buena, which is the financial district, the center of the banking boom, Mission Bay and its marsh, Soma, the center of the tech boom, and the marina, which of course we know is the center of the hookup boom, are all in this special camp. So this is what the city looked like, but of course all of this changed on April 18th, 1906. And the most powerful contemporary account of the earthquake I've ever read was by Jack London, who submitted it was published in Collier's magazine on May 5th. And I just want to read a passage from his story as you see some of these pictures. San Francisco is gone. Nothing remains of it but memories and a fringe of dwelling houses on its outskirts. Its industrial section is wiped out. Its business section is wiped out. Its social and residential section is wiped out. The factories and warehouses, the great stores and newspaper buildings, the hotels and the palaces of the nabobs are all gone. Remains only the fringe of dwelling houses on the outskirts of what was once San Francisco. On Wednesday morning at 5:15 came the earthquake. A minute later, the flames were leaping upward. In a dozen different quarters south of Market Street, in the working class ghetto and in the factories, fires started. There was no opposing the flames. There was no organization, no communication. All the cunning adjustments of a 20th century city had been smashed by the earthquake. An enumeration of the buildings destroyed would be a directory of San Francisco. An enumeration of the buildings undestroyed would be a line and several addresses. An enumeration of the deeds of heroism would stock a library and bankrupt the Carnegie Medal Fund. An enumeration of the dead will never be made. All vestiges of them were destroyed by the flames. I went inside with the owner of a house on the steps of which I sat. He was cool and cheerful and hospitable. Yesterday morning, he said, I was worth $600,000. This morning, this house is all I have left. It will go in 15 minutes. He pointed to a large cabinet. This is my wife's collection of china. This rug upon which we stand is a present. It cost $1,500. Try that piano. Listen to its tone. There are few like it. The flames will be here in 15 minutes. There are no horses. And he was right. Nearly everything burned. But after the earthquake, geologists from Stanford and Berkeley started to walk the path of destruction to the north and south, into Marin and Mendocino, and south in the peninsula and down toward Hollister. And what they found, to their surprise, was a rent or tear in the landscape. At this time, people thought earthquakes were underground implosions or explosions. There was just a glimmer of a different view coming from Japan at that time. And incidentally, this is Alice Eastwood, who saved the botany collection of the California Academy of Sciences. And they began to see something else. Wherever they found the fault, they found that a fence line or a road or a stream had been offset by the fault. So these two pairs of orange dots were once side by side. And not only that, they're all offset in the same sense, which is that whichever side you're on, the other side has moved to the right. And they deemed this or called this right lateral slip. And they found that the slip varied from about 6 to 12 feet, but along the entire 250-mile-long fault, this is what they discovered. And then they said, wait a minute, let's have the Coast and Geodetic Survey come back and survey all those monuments again. Because not only could they confirm that displacement, but they could learn how that displacement changes as you get far from the fault. So these are some of the points that were surveyed continuously before the earthquake and the 50 years before and then right afterwards. Now what I'm going to do is draw a dotted line perpendicular to the San Andreas, and I'm going to slide the arrow representing the slip onto that vector, onto that dotted line. And you can see that when you cross the fault, sure enough, there's about 12 feet of offset. But as you move away, either out toward the Farallones or east toward Mount Diablo, the displacements get smaller and smaller. So it was as if the fault kind of leaped ahead in that direction along the fault, but as you got farther away, less and less seemed to be happening. And then H.F. Reed from Johns Hopkins University said, let's go back and look at all those survey measurements, and let's see if the angles were changing, in fact, because the instruments were more accurate, or maybe there's something else to be learned there. And this is what he found between 1870 and 1905. Things had been moving all along. Things had been moving long before the earthquake. The earthquake wasn't the whole show. So the Farallones had been moving at an inch a year with respect to Mount Diablo in that same right lateral sense. And if you put that dotted line on and you slide each vector with its same distance from the San Andreas, this is what you get. So it's a giant shearing that's going on, and it was going on long before the earthquake. And you can see that the rate of shearing is about an inch a year. So then Reed said, okay, well, let's say that had been going on for a couple hundred years before the earthquake, and not just during the period of our measurement. Then you would have gotten about 12 feet of net displacement between the Farallones on the west and Mount Diablo on the east. Now, if you add to that those displacements they measured during the earthquake, you'd get this. And you put those together, and you just get a simple offset. So it wasn't that the fault jumped ahead. It was that the fault caught up. The thing had been shearing all along, but the fault was stuck. And when the earthquake occurred, it caught up to the distant positions, and everything is really rather simple. So with Reed's view of the earthquake cycle in mind, we can now see something else, which is that if this had been going on for a long time, let's say 10 million years, just a fraction of the age of the Earth, and still smaller than what people thought the Earth's age was then in 10 million years you get 150 miles of displacement. So that was the clue that this earthquake had laid down, that somehow the Earth had to be mobile, even if at that time nobody could explain it. And so looking at the Bay Area from this point of view, one can see not only the Hayward Fault, on which the 1868 earthquake occurred, but a set of roughly parallel faults, all right lateral, all part of this shear. And what had happened in 1906 was one of those faults, the main player, the San Andreas, had ruptured. Now, what Reid really told us, which was so important, is look, if you want to know where the hazard is, if you want to know where future earthquakes are going to occur, you don't have to wait around for them. You need to measure the shear on all those faults. Wherever you're going to see shear, you have the probability of an earthquake occurring. And so today, with 20,000 continuous high-performance GPS monuments around the world, this is the view that we have of the fault system that encircles the globe, with these pinker and warmer colors, stronger shear. And you can pick out individual faults and plate boundaries. But I want to make another point. The plate tectonics view is highly oversimplified. It's not just a simple boundary. Compare this with what you're seeing above on the slide. The deformation extends way into the continent, along with faulting and earthquakes with it. So the continents are these crunch zones, collision zones, where that deformation is carried in the interiors. So this is our understanding of where faults are and how to track them today. The red band that runs more or less east-west in the middle here in Turkey is the North Anatolian Fault. It's the site of the largest and most spectacular falling domino sequence of earthquakes the world has ever known. Between 1939 and 1999, 12 basically magnitude 8 earthquakes going down one after another. And this fault has the same slip rate and length and behavior as the San Andreas. And so here is our San Andreas system over there in California, and you can see it's one of these shear bands like the others. So now what I'd like to do is make Reid's discovery even more real to you by showing you the earthquake machine here. So I'm going to argue that what you see here is everything you need to make earthquakes and nothing extra. It's just got 3 elements. The motion of the interior of the plates, which are steady, which is going to be represented by this casting reel being cranked. A rubber band, which represents the rubberiness, the elasticity of the Earth's crust, without which we wouldn't get earthquakes. I've got these granite kitchen countertop samples here, which are my masses, and they're sitting on top of kind of just industrial non-skid. So my job here is to crank steadily, and your job is to watch whatever happens. So sure enough, every 200 or so years, we get an earthquake, right? Okay, so here's a question for you. Were all the earthquakes the same size? I really need to hear it. This is very bad news. If I can't make regular repeating earthquakes with Home Depot sandpaper or rubber band and kitchen countertop samples, we're never going to get them in the Earth. Because the Earth is going to have much more variability. The elasticity of the Earth's crust comes from the materials. We have basalt, we have granite, we have sediments. They're all different. Faults, some faults are grungy, some are smooth, and they vary along the way. So the uniformity of this sandpaper is much higher than what we're going to find in natural materials. And so this is one of the bitter pills that seismologists like myself have had to swallow over the last 30 years. That variability is real. and it's what we see on all faults. So you can never talk about a fault as being 10 months pregnant. They're not that reliable, and that variation is real, and we could see that, maybe about an average of 1 crank per event, but some of them were half that, some of them were twice that. All right? What if I take this brick off and I just have a 1-bricker, and I crank at the same San Andreas speed of 1 inch a year? Am I going to get more frequent earthquakes or less? So you got to have skin in the game, I got to hear it. Okay. Are they going to be smaller or larger? Okay, so there's a pretty good consensus there. So you're right. So they are smaller and they are more frequent, and you can see why that would be so, because the force resisting motion is the weight of the bricks times the friction. I've halved the weight, friction hasn't changed. So it is able to go earlier, and since the spring never gets as loaded as much, the run out is shorter. Well, we have a place on the San Andreas, a 1-bricker place. It's called Parkfield. It extends between Parkfield and Chelem in Central California. And unlike northern and southern San Andreas that can knock off near 8s, this has a habit of giving us 6.5 earthquakes every 25 to 40 or so years. Okay, what if I do something else? What if you can see that this is a polished surface, it catches the light. This we've sandblasted to make it rough. So what if I just turn this over so I have a polished surface down? Now think about it before you cast your vote. I'm only changing friction on one side of the fault, so it isn't perfectly slick, but I'm going to ask you now, am I going to get more frequent earthquakes or less? And are they going to be smaller or larger? Okay, here we go. So it's kind of creeping, kind of stuttering with really small earthquakes, right? And we have that spot on the San Andreas as well. We call it the creeping section. It extends between Hollister and Parkfield. It's about 100 miles long, and it produces more earthquakes than anywhere else on the San Andreas, and they're all small. And think about it. Same friction, same elasticity, same speed, and we're getting all this diversity of behavior. Okay, now you might say, well, look, the San Andreas is about 700 miles long, and we get a lot of earthquakes that are smaller than that, so shouldn't we begin to think about earthquakes interacting rather than completely in isolation? So to address that, I've got 3 in series now. All right, so now I'm beginning to have a longer San Andreas. Okay, who's going first? This guy, or this guy? So vote. This. Okay, who's going second? This. This could be a trick question, but I want you to have some real stakes in the deal. Okay, here we go. It gets really interesting really fast, right? So first of all, this guy was first, second, third, so you're all wrong. But much more interesting than that is that sometimes this guy eventually loaded this guy and this guy went, and sometimes they all went together. And that's something else we see. We had an earthquake in the Southern California Mojave Desert in 1992, Landers, and there were 3 wannabe faults that on a good day could only knock off a 6.5, and they got together and within 20 seconds ruptured in as magnitude 7.3. And prehistorically, we know that in general they don't do that. So they all got together, and this further greatly complicates the problem of earthquake prediction, because no little earthquake knows it's marked for future greatness. It may take its friends with it, or more likely it won't. And that's not something we know either. Even if this guy is ready to go, we're not sure if it's going to take more with it, and there really is no difference when they first start in what's going to happen. Okay, now here's the final thing I want to show you, and perhaps it's the most important, which is if I have this guy almost ready to go, and I lift this brick, what's going to happen? You're really sure about that, right? You're getting kind of cocky. All right, you're right. Yeah, it goes. And you can think of this as I've unclamped the fault. So my fault's like this here, and the San Andreas is like this, but the enormous force of all that rock above tends to keep the fault surface clamped. If anything unclamps that, it can take off. So if you can unclamp a fault, even a little bit, you don't even have to lift a brick. If you can shave it, you can trigger an earthquake. All right? If I load it up again, and I just pull on the spring a little bit, I can also get an earthquake. I'm increasing the shear stress. So either of these two, and particularly both of them acting together, tend to promote failure. But if I just had an earthquake, and this isn't too strong, nothing. So this only works. The Coulomb criteria for deciding whether or not one earthquake can rupture another depends on the idea that faults are close to failure. If faults aren't close to failure, it doesn't work. And the fact that it generally does work means most faults spend most of their lives close to failure. Okay, so now here's what we're going to do next. We're going to take this kind of one-dimensional world. I'm a pretty happy person in one dimensions. And we're going to go to 2 dimensions in a series of animations that just extend this so you can see how it plays out. Okay. And we're going to do this on the North Anatolian Fault. Okay, so this is the site of the 1999 North Anatolian earthquake, the westernmost extent in Turkey near Istanbul. So I'm going to bring up the North Anatolian Fault, and I'm going to put a fence across the fault like I did in my reed slides, and we're going to watch those squares begin to shear into parallelograms as stress accumulates, and then bang, we have the earthquake, and it catches up. Just what we saw, what Reed saw, right? It's the same phenomena that you saw before. And what I want you to think about is the turning of the squares into parallelograms is just the tensioning of the spring. And when it pops forward, we've had our earthquake. So it's the same phenomena that you're seeing here. Okay, so far so good. But what about beyond the end of the fault? If the fault continued, but it's beyond the end of the rupture, is that part of the fault brought closer to failure, unaffected, or farther from failure by this earthquake? So we want to do that next. And so we're going to just repeat this experiment, but rather than just a fence across the fault, we're going to put a whole grid down, densify the grid, and watch stress accumulate. Now, the edge of the earthquake is about here. I'm going to just pause it for a second. So what we want to know is, you can see how these blocks are a little bit sheared. Are they more sheared after the earthquake, which is equivalent to pulling on the spring, or less? Also, are they pulled this way, which is equivalent to lifting a brick, or smushed, which is equivalent to adding a brick? Okay, so now we have our earthquake, and look, they get more sheared. And if we color the more sheared ones red, we have these blowtorch zones beyond the end of the rupture. So those are the places where we've pulled on the spring, the red ones. Okay, you can see here we've pulled these guys. So this is where we've lifted a brick, and this is where we've added a brick. So if we combine those two, we get the Coulomb criteria, which says after this earthquake, a fault here, and to a lesser extent here and here, and certainly here, is brought closer to failure by this rupture. So this is where we would expect our next aftershocks to be, or possibly the next main shock. Now let me just show you this one more way, in kind of a stop action. So here is the shear stress increase. This is where we've pulled on the rubber band, and this is where we've eased it. Here's where we've lifted a brick and added a brick. We multiply this panel times the friction of the sandpaper, and on faults that's about 0.5. We add them together and we get the Coulomb criteria. Okay, now let's try this out on the North Anatolian Fault. But let's start simple. We'll just iron the fault out so it's straight, and we'll put each earthquake on with its proper length. And what I want you to see is each earthquake nucleates in the blowtorch zone of the preceding event. And this is a way in which earthquakes can propagate down a fault. All right, now let's finally do this on the North Anatolian Fault itself, which isn't quite as straight. Notice that red zone, bang, that's going to get an earthquake. This red zone is going to fill with an earthquake. This one is going to get in 57. Both of these red zones are going to subsequently get earthquakes. This is going to fill in 67. Then this is the one we were looking at in August 1999. And then that turns this red, which ruptures in November 1999. So now when all of this has happened, there's very little red left on this map. And in fact, not only are you seeing that there is a way we can explain the propagation of these earthquakes, I also want you to see that after this spasm of events, almost everything is in this blue zone, what we call the stress shadow, which means that any parallel faults here are also brought farther from failure. So what we've done is taken a brutally hard problem, predicting an earthquake, and instead solved a really easy problem, which is, okay, after that earthquake that we can't predict, what'll happen next? And in a lot of science, that's what we do. We go after the easier part of the problem. Okay, with that in mind, now let's go back to where we were before and look at the earthquake history during the 75 years before the gold rush. And it's stunning. What you see is that earthquakes are ricocheting all over the bay. 6s and 7s everywhere. Not just the Hayward earthquake in 1868, but a big one on the peninsula in 1838 and plenty of others. Now look at the 75 years after the 1906 earthquake. Almost nothing. And if we add now the stress produced by the 1906 earthquake, we can see why this would be so. All of these faults have been affected by the 1906 stress shadow. Its blowtorch zones lie to the south, south of Hollister, and well to the north at Cape Mendocino. So basically, we've put all the faults asleep for nearly 100 years. But this is not the behavior that we had before 1906. And here's the bad news, guys. The gods keep cranking the Quakecaster, and the rubber band is getting tensioned, even though we have initially this strong shadow. So today, it looks something much more like this. So the band on the San Andreas is narrowed because the stress is most profoundly dropped on the fault, and so elsewhere, the stress increases are coming in. They're coming in from the coast, and they're coming in from the inland areas. And so today, most likely the Hayward and Calaveras and Grenville faults and the San Gregorio are much more in play than they were before. So maybe, based on where we're located tonight, it's time for a little bit of gallows humor. But there are other ways to deal with the situation we're in, which is to say, okay, we have earthquakes in our future, very likely, so let's learn to live with them. Let's withstand them. So I want to show you this. This is the pinnacle of seismic design. Why so? It's got a tall, slender column or mast to take the compression loads. It uses stainless steel cables to take the tension loads. It's light on top and heavy on the bottom. But I'm not talking about the bridge. I'm talking about the boat. Here's the amazing thing. There is not a boat in the bay that could not handle the strongest shaking produced by the San Andreas or Hayward Fault. I know you're saying, oh, no, it can't be. That's just because the boats are bobbing around in the water. You're wrong. If I dug a hole in the ground and I took a crane and I lowered that boat into the ground and then I subjected it to the 1906 earthquake, it would be fine. Because it's made of light, strong materials, fiberglass, aluminum, stainless steel, because it's very light on top, it's heaviest on the bottom, and it's constructed with curves and triangles, not cubes. The distinction gets even stronger, even worse, because if we look inside that boat at its galley, you'll see that there are no sharp corners, there are handholds everywhere, no glassware is free to fly around, everything is restrained, every cabinet is latched. And the stoves are even gimbaled. You can make soup during the 1906 earthquake on these boats. Let's see how that compares with any, well, let's say your favorite bar in the Bay Area. Here's mine. How will this look during an earthquake? This is a hard hat zone. And this is real evidence to me that we are in deep quake denial. And here's why. Your homework assignment tonight is to go find a bar that restrains the bottles. It's a tough assignment for people who are indefatigable. And do these people have anything to worry about? Nah, they're a mile from the San Andreas. If I go to Japan, I cannot find a bar that does not restrain the alcohol. And that's a very clear indication that they're taking seriously that's something that we're not. So how could architects be so smart? Naval architects be so smart? And I think the answer is that there's an accelerated kind of Darwinian process of design. If a naval architect builds a boat that can't handle the conditions of any summer day in the bay with 30 knots of wind and high chop, the boat basically keels over and goes to the bottom. And they design a better boat. And that process happens at a very high rate because if you take that boat outside the gate or inside, it's going to sustain those kind of conditions all the time. Whereas for buildings, it's rarely in our experience and we don't think about it. All right, there's one exception. There is a kind of boat that doesn't meet any of these vaunted criteria that I've described, and it's called a houseboat. And if you take this thing out on the bay and turn it broadside to the wind and the waves, it's probably capsizing. And then everything is going to break, and it won't survive. So if there were justice in the world, this would be its naval architect being pooped out the transom. Okay, but here's the bad news, people. We're all living in beached houseboats. We're all living in stacks of cubes that look nothing like that sailboat. Let me show you what I mean. Here's a building made of a stack of cubes. It's bolted to its foundation, which is good, but the feature of a cube is that no matter how strong I make the columns and the beams, it's held together only by its corners. And so when an earthquake occurs, the ground is going to move from side to side. And there's also going to be torsion. And you can see how weak this building is. And if any of those corners breaks, this building is going down. And that's because a cube, or if we're going to be technical about it, a tetrahedra, has no structural integrity. Look at this. IKEA house. Stick it in your station wagon and take it home. This is how we choose to live. This is the exact same building, except we've just snapped in these little corner braces. Literally snapped in with sewing snaps. Okay, watch. Nothing. Nothing. All right. How much do you think it costs? How much more do you think it costs to build this building rather than this building? I want to hear it. 1 to 2%. It's embarrassing, isn't it? And even if you're retrofitting or strengthening an older building, it's like 2 to 3% to get something close to this. I met someone who had just built a home in Portola Valley And his design brief to his engineer and architect is, I want to live in the home right after the next 1906 earthquake, with nothing, no problems of any kind. That cost 5% more to build that building that actually had dashpot dampers in it. This is a decision we need to make. We're making our life difficult if we decide to live in stacks of cubes, but if we're going to do it, let's do it right. So what I want to do now is show you how you can find this out for yourself and see what your options are. And so this is going to show you Tembler. All right, now this is a really exciting thing you're never going to hear in another seminar. I encourage you to bring out your cell phones now. I probably just broke 40 rules of how to be in a MPSF. So you can follow along. If you want to do this on your cell phone, you can. You don't have to. So you just go to tembler.net, Temblor.net. And that's where I am now. And you'll come to our website. And you'll just click to use Tembler for free. And then you just put your email address in here, and I'm going to put in mine, ross@tembler.net, and click go. And that opens the app. It's the same on the phone as on a screen here. And it's found our location, and it's shown us that, I'm sitting here rather close to the Hayward Fault. I'm not that far from the San Andreas Fault, which is having a burst of earthquakes this month, out here at about the spot where the 1906 earthquake actually nucleated. I can see some earthquakes on the Hayward Fault. Here's one 23 days ago. Here's another. I like to see the landscape, so I can go here to the layers menu. And then down here you can see your seismic hazard rank. Oops. So what's that all about? So here is your hazard compared to everywhere else in the lower 48. Now let's just do some comparisons. So how does that compare to San Francisco? San Francisco is considerably lower because it's midway between the two faults. And you saw earlier that the Hayward Fault has got a higher hazard than the San Andreas today, as best we can tell. All right. What about if I were to go down on the peninsula? We'll choose Burlingame here. That's higher than San Francisco. And what about if I were to go to Hayward? It gets much higher. And then it gets higher still. And as these faults start to converge on each other, you can see all the red lines are kind of converging. Things get really ugly down here as we get into Gilroy. And you can see lots of earthquakes. So this gives you a sense of the area. So let's go back to where we are. This little arrow gives you your location. And so now what I want to do is I want to put liquefaction up. So I click the liquefaction layer and I zoom in. What is liquefaction? Liquefaction is that the shaking can cause water to squirt through the sediments and solid ground turns to a slurry and buildings can sink and tilt. So here we are at the Paramount and we're in a high liquefaction zone, although things can be worse, where we have this artificial land. It's kind of interesting that both of our airports are in high liquefaction zones in the Bay Area too. And so the idea is you can find this out for yourself. And it's just a layer you turn on and off. Okay, let's have some fun. I just talked to a real estate agent who had sold a home on Edgewood Drive in Pacifica. Let's go take a look. All right, so we can see that this is a very interesting location in the San Andreas Fault Zone. But it gets even more interesting when I put landslides on it. So I said, Mike, were there any environmental issues in selling a home like this? He goes, yeah, fog. And I said, well, did buyers have any issues with purchasing a home on a landslide on the San Andreas on a steep slope? And he said, we had 8 offers over asking. It sold for $125,000 over asking. Okay, it's up to you. That's the point. Go to open houses with open eyes. That's why Tumblr's on your phone. Open it up, take a look, find out before you put the offer down, before you get so emotionally caught up in it that you can't say no. Because you have a decision to make. No matter where you work within your commute zone, you can be in a higher or a lower hazard, and you certainly want to be outside of a landslide and outside of a liquefaction zone if you possibly can. All right, let's make it more personal. I'm going to put in my mom's condo. She's not in the audience. In Santa Monica. Which she bought 12 years ago. Look at that. I let my mom buy a condo on the Santa Monica Fault. I'm an idiot. And the problem was, it kind of was hard to come by this information and put it all together, particularly when you're in the heat of the moment and you're going to these open houses. And so this is the idea of Tumblr. It's now easy to do this. It's easy to find out whether or not you're making a mistake, because it shouldn't be something that happens too late in the thinking. But okay, so let's say you live there. You slide down here. Let me make this a little bigger. And you can put in the attributes of that home. So let's just leave it here in these default values. Let's say that this home can be rebuilt for $600,000, and we say submit. And now it tells me, what is my chance of damage in this house over the next 30 years? So I have a 50% chance of no damage at all. And that can't be totally wrong, because the last 30 years we haven't seen any damage either. But the flip side of the coin is, I have a 1 in 18 chance, 1 chance in 18 of about $400,000 of damage. That's that red zone here. It's really like throwing darts at this thing. Well, you're more likely to hit the blue, but you could hit the red. In fact, you can look, there's probably 18 people on each row. Look down and say, who's going to be it? That's kind of, I want you to have a little sweat in your palms here now. So what can you do? First of all, you can see below that if you had a standard earthquake insurance policy with a 15% deductible, you'd have a 1 in 7 chance of receiving some kind of payout. Then you can also down here and say, well, how does this 1 in 18 chance of extensive damage compare to other things that I protect myself for or insure for? And you can see that compared to burning down your home, totaling your car, getting sued, by the way, we call this the Have a Nice Day display, earthquakes are your biggest threat and the one that we're ignoring. Okay, so what if you say, all right, now I'm interested in retrofitting? Then you can see here that we calculate the cost of your retrofit and its benefit and say you would most likely gain $9,000 from that effort. And you'd be 3 times safer because less stuff would fall on you. So you can see, and then finally if I said, okay, what would my chances look like if I retrofitted? So $390,000 damage went from 1 chance in 18 to 1 chance in 42. So you can see the benefits of making this. So you can put Tumblr on your phone, if it's an iPhone or an iPad on the left or an Android on the right, and then it behaves just like an app. So you can see what we have in mind. It works everywhere in the US, and the goal is go in with your eyes open. Okay, where have we come tonight? I think you've seen that California's beauty and its climate and its wealth and certainly its history is inseparable from its seismic setting. But even more profoundly here in the Bay Area, the losses, the deep losses in 1906 Ironically and serendipitously, our sciences gain. So here's how I, as a scientist, would like to repay you for that debt. It's by giving you the means and motivation to make yourself more resilient to future quakes. Thank you.
Fracking is the topic du jour. What evidence is there for fracking increasing quakes, such as in Oklahoma?
Okay, so first, you may not know that a year and a half ago, Oklahoma dethroned California as the most seismically active state in the lower 48. We're really steamed about this. We're thinking of fracking just to catch up right here in California, the only noble course to take. So it turns out it's not the fracking per se that causes earthquakes. It's the reinjection of what in the oil patch they call produced water, fracking fluids, which are highly toxic, and the water that comes out with the gas and oil needs to be reinjected at great depth so that it doesn't end up in the water table. So if you reinject it at great depth, you get access to faults. And even though these faults are moving probably very slowly in that area, they are being loaded. And if you squirt fluids in there, and if you squirted fluids in there, you can get faults to move. So we're accelerating, if you like, natural earthquakes on real faults by making them more slippery. That's what's happening. And it's a matter of the the injection pressures and volumes that control this.
So how does fracking affect fault shear?
That's a really good question. Probably it's probably playing relatively little role in increasing the shear. The faults have to be loaded or they're not going to produce earthquakes, but apparently even in Oklahoma, they're loaded faults. And of course, we did have a giant earthquake, a magnitude 7.5 in 1811 and 1812 in Missouri. So even far from the plate boundaries, we can have loaded faults. So what we're probably not changing the shear, we're simply lowering the friction on those faults by making them slippery and basically floating the two faces off each other from the enormous injection pressures of those fluids.
Do you think that fracking should be permitted in California?
About 5 years ago, oil company operators felt that the biggest play in the nation was going to be California for gas. And it didn't pan out that way. So it's my understanding that there's quite a bit less enthusiasm for fracking in California, not just because Californians tend to resist this wanton grab for money, but because it's not going to be as lucrative as it is in Oklahoma and Texas and in Kansas. I think on top of that, the collapse of the price of oil and gas will greatly reduce any efforts to start drilling because the initial overhead costs of that process is enormous. What's happening in Oklahoma is the wells are already drilled. There are no more overhead costs. So even though the price of oil has plummeted, the rate of induced earthquakes has not.
Final fracking question. Does fracking reduce rupture force?
So if I understand the question, you might say, well, if we have a lot of little earthquakes being fracked, will that reduce the likelihood for a big one? And I often see, by the way, geologists argue or claim that because Oklahoma has a lot of little earthquakes, we don't have to worry about big ones. That's garbage. Here's the deal. It's a numbers game. For every magnitude 7, there are 1,000 fives. If you have to have 1,000 fives to do the work of a 7. So having a lot of little earthquakes, we'll just never have enough of them to take care of the need to have a big one. There's no evidence in the oil patch that these earthquakes preclude the possibility of larger events. So in my judgment, if we do this long enough, we are going to see larger earthquakes. And then when we do get a very large damaging earthquake, and we've already had a couple 5.7s, then it's going to be a whole new ballgame. Because obviously there are a lot of people who have different stakes in this. So it's uncharted territory, but there's no question in my mind that if things continue, the likelihood of seeing larger earthquakes in the oil patch is very real.
So this is, I think, a local version of part of that question, but last year in September, October, San Ramon had a cluster of about 400 quakes. Is this an indicator of a larger quake or a positive sign of pressure being relieved? I guess it's the same thing, right?
Oh, that's such a great question. The San Ramon swarm was truly amazing on the Calaveras Fault, or actually right off the Calaveras Fault. And it's something that we see quite often on a lot of different faults, and it's a mystery to us too. If I had to guess, I would say what's happening is the fault is creeping. And remember, when we saw this fault creep, when I flipped it over, we saw tons of little earthquakes. And I think, for whatever reason, the fault starts to creep at depth, and it's accompanied by this staccato cascade of little quakes. So something is going on there, and probably there's a much elevated chance of that triggering a larger earthquake. You know, any one of those little guys could bring along his brethren under conditions that we don't completely understand. So swarms like this are frequent on a lot of different faults, and they're probably telling us that temporarily the chances of a larger earthquake are greater. That swarm stopped. It started in October. It stopped in about January. So we appear to be back to normal.
How do you interpret the reported spike last week in carbon monoxide levels along the subduction zone of the western U.S.? Some are saying this is a precursor to a major earthquake in the next week or so. Agree or disagree?
Well, wouldn't it be great if we had a reliable precursor to earthquakes? And really, it's something that an enormous effort has been waged over the last 30 or 40 years to find gas emissions, electrical sparks, any kind of signals that are precursory. And it is extremely difficult. So I doubt that the gas is an indication of an earthquake coming. It's different for volcano earthquakes because volcanoes produce a lot of gas and a lot of fluids, and eruptions and pre-eruptions are often accompanied by earthquakes. So on a volcano, I'd have a different answer. But for a subduction zone or any other fault, I would say there's no evidence that this kind of behavior is followed by an earthquake. And let me explain something to show you how difficult this problem is. If we're talking about a magnitude 7 earthquake, let's say 50 miles, 60 miles long, the area that is probably giving right before the earthquake is about the size of this room, and it's 10 miles down. And the amount that it's giving is probably millimeters. You try to capture that on the Earth's surface. It's extremely difficult. You might have heard even that when often, just before we had an earthquake, you'd hear like one sand grain break. Well, that's kind of like a foreshock. But foreshocks have been completely unreliable. 5% of earthquakes are preceded by foreshocks, the rest aren't. Nobody has found a precursor which is a reliable indicator of a future earthquake. We'll keep looking, but this is a really tough problem, and the reason why it's tough is that fault at depth, at 10 or 15 miles deep, is moving at 1 inch a year, and it speeds up to 3,000 miles an hour in 3 seconds.
Okay. In the movie San Andreas, the entire fault went. Is this possible?
I loved the movie San Andreas. I'll tell you a little story. I was on a panel when the movie was first aired in San Francisco, and I was asked, well, you know, what's realistic about this movie? And I said, that's like asking someone from the Centers for Disease Control what's realistic about Ghostbusters. But Kate Long from the California Office of Emergency Services had a better line. She said, what's unrealistic about this movie is that any woman would divorce Dwayne Johnson. So everything else about the movie is perfectly accurate.
What was your motivation to create Tembler? It's a brilliant idea, beautifully executed, and will be helpful to us/everyone.
Thank you for that question. Really, for us, or for me as a researcher, it was the realization that as much as we work, as much as we talk about earthquakes to people, we're slipping into denial. We're slipping into deep denial. And maybe it's understandable with every passing year after Northridge and Loma Prieta, it just seems to recede. So we're not getting through. And my co-founder and I felt that the reason why we're not getting through is we're not making it personal. Most of us don't really care about an earthquake, a magnitude 6.5 somewhere in the Bay Area, sometime over the next 30 years. We care about our home, our family, or my mom's condo, or my daughter's apartment. And so we had to make it personal, we had to make it immediate, and we had to make it translate into terms people deal with. Dollars, safety. So that's the goal. Put whatever we know in your hands so that you can make the decision that's in your best financial interest, not us.
Can you give your point of view of the, I think it's pronounced L'Aquila scientists that were charged in Italy?
Oh, it's a sad story. I am good friends with 5 of the 7 of the L'Aquila 7 accused of manslaughter, convicted, and now they were convicted of manslaughter, and now that has been reversed. It's on appeal, and hopefully that sad story will end. First of all, it was a huge miscarriage of justice, but many people died, and there was a lot of anger and a lot of feeling that the scientists gave at least mixed signals. The scientific signal was conveyed through politicians where it got very muddled. It's taught us a lot. It's been a very hard lesson that it's important always, the compact that we have as scientists with the public is we need to tell you what we know, and we need to tell you what we don't know. And we need to say those things in terms you'll understand. And in a sense, the scientists or the politicians who spread the scientific word were too soothing. And so when the earthquake occurred, people felt they hadn't been properly alerted. The real tragedy of L'Aquila was not the lack of a prediction, because nobody can predict. It's that people were living in homes that just crumbled in a small earthquake, a magnitude 6.2 earthquake. That's what's tragic, and they had done nothing about it. Even their version of FEMA was housed in a building that completely collapsed. So, it comes down to those buildings, not to the scientists. If we can live in stronger buildings, then we can accept the limitations of our science, that we can't predict earthquakes, but we can still live safely with them.
Is there a causal relationship between climate change and earthquakes?
Not an easy or direct one, is the short answer to that question. Filling of reservoirs, and therefore emptying of reservoirs, does change the conditions of fluid pressure in fault zones. And so we know that the filling of a number of reservoirs, the Oroville Reservoir in the California foothills as an example, the biggest earthquake induced by a reservoir that's indisputable is a 6.9 in Koyna, India. So climate change has caused a lot of reservoirs to drop. So there is a weak connection there. We have an increase in earthquakes on the periphery of Greenland, because these are basically ice quakes as the ice is kind of chattering along the rock as it flows out of Greenland. Beyond that, I think that climate change needs to be dealt with on its own terms, and not because it changes the rate of earthquakes.
Wouldn't it make more sense, or at least be a better use of time, to concentrate on response to an earthquake rather than prediction?
Well, I agree with that statement, but there are things we can do. So One that I've talked about tonight is the idea that once we've had a large earthquake, we know quite a bit about where large aftershocks are more likely to occur and where they're not, and where subsequent main shocks could occur. That's important information for people because, you know, the sad truth is after the big one, there'll be more. It's not over, it's really just beginning. Another aspect of this is earthquake early warning, which California is now emboldened enough, along with other states in the West, to begin to build. And this will, under the ideal circumstance, give people several seconds to tens of seconds of warning before an earthquake, simply because the earthquake is detected at its source, and that information is sent to you on your cell phone before the shaking gets there, gets to you. Well, this is also going to confer a lot of safety. It's not an earthquake prediction, but it's one of the things we should do to help prepare. Beyond those things, I think absolutely the biggest strides we can make is to live more resiliently, to live in better buildings, so that we don't have to worry as much about when the earthquake would occur. Think about this. If we all lived in geodesic domes, we would not have this seminar tonight, because you wouldn't care about earthquakes, right? They would just be kind of fun.
What kind of risk to the Bay Area would a tsunami be after a San Andreas earthquake?
Fortunately, because the motion of the San Andreas, even its offshore portion, is mostly horizontal, it isn't producing a large tsunami. So tsunamis are largely produced when the land is, the seafloor is lifted or dropped. However, you can get large local tsunamis due to underwater landslides, and sometimes underwater landslides do accompany strike-slip earthquakes. The other issue that protects us is the Golden Gate itself. It's very narrow. You have to aim the tsunami just right, like those Golden Gate Gold Rush ships, to get in. And if it does get in, as it did in the 2011 Japanese tsunami, it kind of heads down toward Emeryville and the East Bay and misses most of the bay. So we're fairly invulnerable to tsunamis, except on the coast. Santa Cruz, Pacifica, Bodega, those are vulnerable places. And if I'm going to just pick a fight here, Bodega, Stinson Beach. I mean, I hope nobody has a place in Stinson Beach. I mean, it's a sand spit on the fault. If you survive, you'll be eaten by a shark. I just don't understand. Why would anybody put a house on a sand spit on the fault?
I'm glad we didn't talk about that last night in Marin. Where can we see physical effects of earthquakes, splits in the ground, etc.?
Oh, that's a great question. So at Point Reyes National Seashore, there is a interpretive walk where you can see offset fences and features. There's also one in the Palo Alto Foothill Park has a kind of an interpretive guided, self-guided walk where you can see some features. I'd say Point Reyes, which is also spectacularly beautiful and a wonderful place to be, you know, this is how we enjoy our faults. We go to Tamales Bay and we go to Inverness. It's really a great place to see it. I'm not aware of an equivalent spot on the Hayward Fault. Instead, you just have a freeway. You want to know where the fault is? Follow the freeway.
Tell us something about the Cascadia subduction zone.
So what's fascinating about Cascadia was that while it's been known for a long time that this is a subduction zone up here, there was no historical record of earthquakes, and the trench is filled with sediments. So 20 years ago, it was decided that there was really no earthquake threat there. This was an aseismic subduction zone, so smooth that no earthquakes occurred. And so Washington built nuclear power plants in the area. And then a colleague of mine, Brian Atwater from the USGS, started to, with a canoe, go into the inland estuaries along the coast, and he found stands of trees that had all been drowned at the same time, and they had sand layers around their trunks. And he said, this seems to him to be a place where the land suddenly sank and tsunami deposits went across the trees. And he carbon dated the tree rings on these trees and was getting dates like from 1650 to 1750 or so. Carbon dating isn't that precise. And he said, well, this is the end of the story. I can't tell if this is one earthquake or a bunch, and I don't know exactly when it occurred because it's prehistoric. And he was talking to Kenji Satake from Japan, and Kenji said, well, heathen, it may be pre-civilization for you, but not for us. And if any of these earthquakes actually occurred that you're describing, it would have sent a tsunami across the Pacific, just like their tsunami came here. So he brought together a Japanese historian, and she went to the harbor records all along Japan and found that on January 26, 1700, an orphan tsunami hit Japan. And then he did calculations to show it could only come from Cascadia, and it had to be a magnitude 9. So we went from no record and no understanding to an earthquake where we knew the time and the date and the size. So now it's quite clear that there is a hazard, and there's evidence that this has recurred. So this is a very real concern that coastal communities and even inland communities would be subjected to the kind of shaking that Tohoku experienced just a few years ago.
So the New Yorker ran the article then about Seattle, right? So the question here is Seattle more dangerous than San Francisco as depicted in that article?
So first of all, Catherine Schultz's article is a beautiful example of effectively reaching the public and talking straight. So I really endorse what she did and the importance of the power of a reporter to remind people of what's in their future. Regarding Seattle, it's a tricky situation. Seattle, that's not Seattle's only problem. There is something called the Seattle Fault, runs east-west right through downtown, and much of downtown is built on a liquefaction site. So the subduction zone is 100 miles away, and by the time the waves get there, all the high-frequency motion is going to disappear, and it'll be the long waves which attack tall buildings, think Space Needle, and dams and bridges. If the Seattle Fault ruptured, it'd be very high-frequency shaking, which attacks homes and shorter buildings. So Seattle has to worry about both, but even after saying that, the USGS model for earthquake hazards in the United States would say that we have a higher hazard right here, and by a lot, by a factor of 4 or 5 in terms of the likelihood of shaking strong enough to damage a home. So we have our homework to do.
When you say that the San Francisco Financial District and SOMA are essentially junk land, are you implying that the Transamerica Tower and other skyscrapers and office buildings are vulnerable to collapse?
Well, of course, junk land isn't a technical term. Probably was ill-advised of me. I think they call it fill. Then there's another category called engineered fill. I think that's, like when the rabbi blesses the food and it's then kosher. Engineered fill, it's been blessed as engineered. It's very, very difficult to know. But when it comes to buildings, tall buildings in the financial district, the engineers are well aware of the nature of this soil, and they put pylons very deep through it. So it's basically like tines of a fork. That's what these buildings look like if you yank them out of the ground. And actually, if I was going to choose a building to have Temblor's intergalactic headquarters in, I think I'd choose the Transamerica Tower because it's heavy on the bottom, it's light on top, it's built with triangles, it's actually the closest thing to a sailboat I can find that's a building in the Bay Area. So I think, and we've actually, USGS has seismometers up and down that building, recorded the Loma Prieta earthquake in that building. It does amplify the shaking as you go up, but nothing like most buildings.
What advice would you give to a poor country like Nepal in order to protect people and centuries-old buildings?
Oh, that's a great question and a really important one. What I'm struck by is that the principles of building stronger buildings triangles, flexible materials, heavy on the bottom, light on top, attaching them to their foundations, do not require wealth. Home-built buildings can be made safer if someone understands how to do so. And there's some fantastic nonprofit organizations, Build Change and Geohazards International, which work with local masons and carpenters in Nepal to help them learn these practices so they can build them themselves. I'll tell you a little story that 2 summers ago, my wife had this crazy idea that we would help fund a school in East Africa for politically displaced people. And the school was built with the help of 12 couples, and then we went to Kenya to the site of the school to finish it and to open it. And it's built in the traditional way with heavy basaltic blocks and kind of spindly columns and a wood frame and aluminum roof. And when we got there, we were greeted with the most incredible outpouring of gratitude I'd ever experienced, and learned for the first time that a school is not just a place of instruction for people without means. It's City Hall, it's where food is stored, it's hope, it's the future. And then as we walked up to these beautiful schools, I could see they were on a fault scarp. So here I am the biggest hypocrite that ever lived. I have helped build a school which won't survive an earthquake on a fault. And this was the other motivation for Tembler. In these incredibly poor places in Africa where people barely have water, people have cell phones because they transact all of their financial affairs on their cell phones. If I buy a cow from you, then you send me the money on your phone, I see it on my phone, and the cow changes hands. So if we can put this information available for everybody, people can begin to understand they're at risk. And that's what we have to do. This isn't just a California problem. This is a worldwide problem in which the solution is right in front of us. We just have to apply it.
So we've got about 5 minutes left, and now come the real meat of this whole thing. What is your opinion on the usefulness or practicality of earthquake insurance? Specifically, if according to your Tembler app, my liquefaction risk is low, landslide risk is moderate, and proximity to the Hayward Fault is less than 1 mile.
So insurance has always been a topic that everybody has different points of view about, and our idea at Tembler was, look, let's let people know as best we can what the likelihood of seeing a payout from insurance is, and then a decision can be made. So, for the first time, for my own home, I can see that the chance for over 30 years of seeing a payout from insurance is about 1 out of 10. That's just a modest payout. The chance of seeing a really large payout, $400,000, is about 1 in 20. And so for the first time I've been able to think about, is this what I need to protect myself? And it looks to me like it is something that I should be doing. And I didn't know that before, so I couldn't ever assess its value. So I think the answer for everybody is different, exactly what chance you're willing to take and how important the amount of money is that would be necessary to rebuild your home. So what I would like people to do is to encounter this and decide, okay, what do I want to prepare myself for? I don't think there's any one answer. And I would also say that if you're in a heavy-duty liquefaction or landslide zone, insurance starts to look much better because it's very difficult to retrofit yourself out of that problem. In Christchurch, New Zealand, just a magnitude 6.3 wiped out the entire downtown business district, and many perfectly built homes just sank or tilt, and then they were a total loss. So under those circumstances, insurance looks very good. But even for me, I think my view about this has been changing through trying to understand this.
Would you recommend private or state-backed California earthquake insurance?
Well, I'm not an insurance broker. This shouldn't be a surprise. But I would say that you have choices. You have a state-chartered, privately funded fund the California Earthquake Authority policy, and then there are about 25 other companies that are offering earthquake insurance. They have reinsurance, so they are insured themselves. So presumably the system is sound. This system is in place because after Northridge, nobody wanted to sell earthquake insurance. So the state said, if you don't offer earthquake insurance, you can't sell homeowners insurance. And the insurance company said, fine, we're not offering homeowner insurance. And so then meant no mortgages, and that's the definition of a political crisis. So along came the California Earthquake Authority to solve that problem, and little by little now, other companies are in the mix. So there is a large market, and there's lots of diversity in the policies, and so it's something to explore, and what's best for you.
Do you think it's necessary to have a week's supply of food and water if you live in an urban or suburban area?
So I think we should all have earthquake emergency kits. If you drive a lot, you should have one in your trunk of your car because you're likely to be with it, and maybe one in your home. And I don't know about a week, but I think you should have food and water for at least several days. And based on how we're all living today, we need to be able to recharge our cell phones. That probably means a solar unit. So I think this is something we should all have so that we can, after the earthquake, be a hero and not a victim. So we're taken care of so we can help take care of others.
Last question, and you sort of intimated the answer, but do you have earthquake insurance on your home?
I'm in the process. So, so I was lying in bed the other night, and I said to my wife, you know, I'm 62. Why don't I give up life insurance and get earthquake? Why don't we give up life insurance and get earthquake insurance? And she said, speak for yourself. And for the first time, I realized she just loves me for my breakup value. Good night.